Something just happened in the Middle East that almost nobody in Washington is talking about. And I need you to understand exactly what it means. Because if you miss this, you will miss the entire arc of the next decade of global power. Let me start with a simple question. Why would China, in the middle of trade war tensions, in the middle of tariff escalations, in the middle of what the Trump administration has been calling an economic confrontation with Beijing, why would China suddenly deepen its military and economic footprint in the Persian Gulf? Why now? Why there? And why with Iran? Because the answer to that question tells you everything about what China is actually doing. And it tells you that what is being sold to the American public as a trade war is actually something far more dangerous, far more structural, and far more irreversible than a few percentage points on semiconductor tariffs. The Strait of Hormuz. Say those words out loud and understand what they mean. 20% of the world's oil passes through that narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman. 20%. That is not a shipping lane. That is an artery. That is a jugular vein of the global economy. Whoever controls the Strait of Hormuz does not just control oil. They control the leverage over every country that depends on oil, which is to say they control the leverage over almost every country on earth. The United States has understood this for 50 years. That is why the Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. That is why American carrier groups have been rotating through the Persian Gulf since the Carter Doctrine in 1980. The entire post-war American grand strategy in the Middle East has been organized around one single principle. No hostile power shall control the Strait of Hormuz. China just changed that calculation, and they did it quietly. They did it patiently. And they did it in a way that the Trump administration, for all its aggressive rhetoric about confronting Beijing, either did not see coming or did not know how to stop. Here is what actually happened. China's relationship with Iran is not new. The China-Iran Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, signed in 2021, was a 5-year agreement worth potentially $400 billion in infrastructure, energy, and military cooperation. But for the past 3 years, that agreement has been moving slowly, strategically, beneath the surface. While the world was distracted by Ukraine, by Gaza, by the South China Sea, now it is accelerating. Chinese engineering firms are building port infrastructure on Iran's southern coastline. Chinese naval vessels have been participating in joint exercises in the Gulf of Oman with Iran and Russia. Chinese investment is flowing into Iranian energy infrastructure at a moment when Western sanctions have made Iran economically desperate and therefore strategically pliable. Iran needs China, and China, for the first time in its history, is in a position to use that need to plant a flag. Not a literal flag, not a military base with a red banner, but something more durable, more consequential, an economic and strategic presence that effectively makes the Strait of Hormuz a Chinese-managed choke point. Now, here is where it gets even more interesting. And this is the part that Washington does not want to say out loud. The Trump administration came into office promising to be tough on China, tariffs, technology restrictions, decoupling. The language has been maximalist and confrontational. And yet, while all of that noise was happening at the trade level, at the level of semiconductors and electric vehicles and rare earths, China was executing a completely different strategy at the geopolitical level. They were not fighting the trade war. They were going around it. They were moving to a chessboard where the United States has far less leverage, far fewer pieces, and far less public attention. Think about what China has done in the past 18 months. They brokered the Saudi-Iran rapprochement. That was the moment that should have set off alarm bells in every intelligence agency in Washington. Saudi Arabia and Iran. Two countries that have been in a cold proxy war for decades, shaking hands in Beijing. China did not do that for symbolic reasons. China did that because it understood something profound. If you can neutralize the Sunni-Shia divide in the Persian Gulf, if you can get Riyadh and Tehran speaking to each other rather than trying to destroy each other, you remove the single greatest structural barrier to Chinese influence in the region. You create a gulf where American military presence starts to look not like a necessary stabilizing force, but like an uninvited guest. And now, layer on top of that, what is happening with the Houthi situation in Yemen. The Houthis have been attacking shipping in the Red Sea. American and British forces have been striking Houthi positions. Iran backs the Houthis. And yet, through all of this, the one country that has maintained open diplomatic channels with both Iran and Saudi Arabia, the one country that has not fired a single missile, the one country that has emerged from this regional chaos with its relationships intact on all sides is China. China is not in the war. China is above the war. The argument that China is positioning itself as the only major power capable of engaging with all sides in a fractured global system is not accidental. It reflects a deliberate long-term strategic design. Beijing is steadily crafting an image of itself as the indispensable broker in an increasingly multipolar world. This approach is marked by patience, discipline, and continuity qualities that, when compared to the often reactive and short-term nature of U.S. foreign policy cycles, give China a structural advantage. Rather than seeking dominance through overt confrontation, China is building influence through consistency, predictability, and calculated engagement across rival blocs. To understand what it means to say the Strait of Hormuz is becoming China's one must move beyond traditional notions of control. This is not about military bases, naval patrols, or visible enforcement of maritime dominance. Instead, it is about something more subtle, yet arguably more enduring: structural influence. In the modern geopolitical landscape, control over a strategic choke point does not require gunboats. It requires shaping the conditions under which that choke point operates. China is doing this by cultivating economic dependencies, forging diplomatic ties with all relevant actors, and embedding itself physically through infrastructure investments. These three pillars, economic leverage, political access, and logistical presence, combine to form a kind of influence that is less visible than military power, but often more resilient. China's deepening relationship with Iran is a critical component of this strategy. Through long-term economic agreements, Beijing gains leverage over Tehran's strategic calculus, particularly regarding energy flows and regional stability. At the same time, China maintains strong and growing ties with Gulf Arab states such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. This dual engagement allows Beijing to position itself as the only external power capable of maintaining dialogue across the region's fault lines. It does not demand alignment or ideological loyalty. Instead, it offers economic partnership, infrastructure development, and diplomatic balance. In doing so, China presents itself as a stabilizing force, one that reduces the need for open conflict while preserving its own strategic interests. This stands in contrast to the implicit bargain offered by the United States during the Trump administration. Washington's approach was rooted in confrontation. Maximum pressure on Iran, paired with expectations that regional allies would align firmly against both Tehran and Beijing. While initiatives like the Abraham Accords aimed to reshape regional alliances, they were ultimately built on a framework that required choosing sides. China's counteroffer was fundamentally different. It asked for no such commitments. Instead, it proposed a model of engagement based on mutual economic benefit, non-interference, and inclusive diplomacy. For Gulf states seeking stability and economic diversification, this approach proved more attractive. As a result, key regional players have increasingly embraced a hedging strategy. Saudi Arabia now exports more oil to China than to any other country, signaling a shift in its economic orientation. The UAE has emerged as a critical node for Chinese financial activity, including mechanisms that can circumvent Western sanctions. Qatar, despite hosting one of the largest U.S. military bases in the region, continues to deepen its energy and investment ties with Beijing. These decisions are not acts of disloyalty toward the United States. They are rational responses to a changing global environment. However, the cumulative effect is a gradual rebalancing of influence in the Persian Gulf, one that tilts in China's favor. What makes this shift particularly significant is the nature of the tools being used. The United States has largely relied on tariffs, export controls, and bilateral pressure measures suited to economic competition but ill-equipped for long-term geopolitical positioning in a region defined by relationships and infrastructure. China, by contrast, is investing in ports, energy projects, and long-term contracts that lock in influence for decades. These are not easily reversible decisions. Infrastructure endures. Supply chains, once established, create dependencies that are costly to unwind. Diplomatic relationships, when built on sustained engagement rather than conditional alignment, tend to deepen over time. This is why the timeline matters. China is not operating on the cadence of election cycles or short-term policy shifts. It is pursuing a generational strategy aimed at embedding itself within the core structures of global energy and trade. The Persian Gulf, as the nexus of a significant portion of the world's oil supply, is central to this vision. By shaping the economic and political environment around the Strait of Hormuz, China is not seizing control in a traditional sense. It is redefining what control means. The broader implication is that the most consequential developments in global power competition are not always the most visible. While public attention often focuses on trade disputes, tariffs, or technological rivalry, the deeper transformation is unfolding in regions like the Persian Gulf. There, through a combination of economic integration, diplomatic inclusivity, and strategic patience, China is steadily expanding its influence. If this trajectory continues, the balance of power in one of the world's most critical regions may shift not through conflict, but through the quiet accumulation of structural advantages.